My Story of Banksia, Our Island Retreat by Trish Ritman, 1976 to 2024. Preface. Years ago, when my husband Hein and I were in our 30s, we made an impulsive decision, one that was unusual. It took us down a new path and certainly involved some risks, with an appealing hint of adventure. Over time, most of our experiences were valuable, although some we could have done without. The agreement to buy 300 acres of sandy scrubland on French Island in the middle of Western Port Bay was made without consideration for the pluses or minuses. It was a fun, impulsive decision. I'd just been through the harrowing experience of watching my mother die of a fast-moving cancer and my father feel helpless as she bravely accepted her fate. At that time, Dad was president of the Peter MacCallum Centre, which specialised in the treatment of cancer. It was ironical that after his years of voluntary work for this illness, he had to suffer the tragic loss of his dear wife. I had returned to work that year after 7 years at home raising 4 children, and at last they were at school, so there were more hours in the day. Then Mum became sick, and every spare moment was spent trying to help until she died early in 1976. So it was that I received an inheritance. Hein and his family had been brought to Australia by Australian paper manufacturer, APM Company, from Holland in 1950. My father-in-law took up the position of industrial chemist in APM's research laboratory in Alphington. Hein and his 2 brothers were firmly encouraged to complete their schoolwork with diligence and to master the English language. Spare time was spent exploring and camping in the Australian bush, which they loved. This time certainly laid the foundation for Hein's ongoing interest in the bush. On finishing school, he initially completed a degree in agricultural science and then in medicine, and took up practice as a general practitioner at the Toorak Clinic in Melbourne. His greatest joy was being in the outdoors and sharing his extensive knowledge about birds and native flowers. His enthusiasm knew no bounds, and his energy was hard to keep up with. My background couldn't have been more different. I am a 4th-generation Australian, descended from farming and industrialists who have settled in Victoria in the 1840s from England and Ireland. When we first visited French Island, our children, 3 boys, Henk, Freddie and David, and our daughter Anna, aged between 12 and 7 years, were safely at home. Hein and I were looking for a country property for family holidays within our inheritance. Chapter 1. Buying Land on French Island. Why did we choose a mostly forgotten island in Western Port Bay? The isolation of the island attracted us, the feeling of space and the freedom from conventional society. We soon learned that it had an interesting history. It is the largest of the Western Port Islands, being 16.350 hectares in a triangular shape. It is protected from the ocean by Phillip Island to the south and surrounded by deep channels to fast-flowing tidal water. It was originally surveyed by French explorers from the sailing ship the Naturalist in 1802. They named it Île-de-France and claimed as a French discovery in 1811. However, the French didn't think it was suitable for a settlement. The French naturalist M. Quoy in 1826 advised those intending to visit Île-de-France not to wait for low tide because it is surrounded by very deep soft mud into which you can sink up to the waist. At this time, Governor King in Sydney heard the French were exploring this area and sent 2 sailing ships from Botany Bay to Western Port Bay to forestall a perceived threat from the water, now known as the barge landing. They went on to found a settlement on the headland near present-day Coronella on the mainland and set up a battery of 2 guns to protect the entrance to the channel from the French. However, the French did not return to this area and the British settlement was withdrawn some 15 months later. Governor Darling advised the Earl of Bathurst in London that the local circumstances of Western Port do not hold out any inducements to settlers. Extensive mudflats prevent an approach to the shore except at high water, and an impervious swampy brush or scrub appears to preclude all access to the interior of the country. Also, the local Aboriginals, thought to be from the Bunurong tribe, didn't live on the island. However, it was known that they travelled across the channel by canoe to collect swan eggs and kangaroo rats, probably today's potoroos. The first large settlement was in the Depression of the 1890s, when the island was extensively surveyed and 5 townships planned with churches, schools and 10-acre farms drawn up, but not developed. The small farms offered to settlers proved difficult to make a living on in the isolated conditions. Over the following century, 2 main families succeeded by buying up land and growing chicory, which was smoked in kilns fired by blue gums that were plentiful. Descendants of these families are now large landholders on the southern part of the land. Currently, there are approximately 100 families farming on French Island, the northern 2/3 being national park land managed by Park Victoria. 150 years after the 19th century explorers, Hein and I came ashore on the French Island barge landing in a motorboat under the charge of an overly enthusiastic real estate agent from Gippsland. A parcel of 300 acres of land had been advertised for sale at a price which we could afford. The owner, Mike Woods, was also with us and keen to sell as his wife wanted to move to Western Victoria. It was a stinking hot day on the 26th of May 1976. We were in our 30s and our 4 children were in their middle school years, and we were looking for a place to take them camping in the school holidays. In particular, we wanted a piece of uninhabited country where they could explore, ride their bikes safely and sleep under the stars. We wanted to share our love of the outdoors and to let them experience the joy of being self-sufficient in the bush. Perhaps Hein and I also wanted an escape from the pressures of work in our city life. After securing the boat on the beach by anchor, Hein and I, the agent and Mike, walked for 2 kilometres up a sandy road, through a straggly messmate forest, past cleared farming land with cattle grazing, to a large area of uncleared, head-high scrub on the top of the hill. This was the land for sale. We entered the property through a narrow track to a tin shed and were able to quench our thirst with rainwater from a tank as we enjoyed the sweeping view of the bay to the south and east, framed by the Strzelecki Ranges. I don't remember looking inside the shed or seeing much of the property before we traipsed back down the hill in the unrelenting sun to the barge landing. Here we were greeted with the daunting prospect of the boat stranded 3 metres above the water level as the tide had gone out. After much exertion, pulling and heaving the heavy tinny down the beach towards the water, we were finally off the island and somehow had agreed to be the new owners of the land. Sometimes the best decisions are made on the spur of the moment. Chapter 2. Getting to the island by fishing boat. Our first visit to our new property in August 1976 was from Stony Point on the mainland, a small fishing town on Western Port Bay. A local fisherman and raconteur, Vin Smith, took passengers to the west coast of the island. Vin was small, strong and weather-beaten and highly skilled in the working of his elderly fishing boat. Over the years we were fortunate to enjoy many trips with him across the channel to Tankerton Jetty. Sometimes the sea was rough and stormy, and boarding the boat was hazardous, and sometimes still benign and picturesque. but always an adventure. Getting into the boat and setting out to sea transported us into a different world. Our busy life dropped away, and I was enveloped in the wind and the sea and the elements, whilst Finn recounted tales of fishing and delighted our children with stories about navigating the bay. Our nearest neighbour, John Woodruff, had arranged Hein and my first trip as landowners. We were collected at Tankerton Jetty by an islander, George Andrews, to drive the 12 miles to and from Tankerton Jetty to our place on the other side of the island. I remember my surprise as we all squashed into this dilapidated car with broken windows and doors that had to be held shut. It was one of a group of worn-looking vehicles parked at the Tankerton Jetty, waiting for their owners to arrive by sea. There was little sign of such things as registration, roadworthiness or seatbelts. This was indeed a different world. We set off with much engine noise and rattled and bounced over the dirt road past the footy oval and post office, up a steep hill, and then past a farmhouse, a sharp left turn, and to the right onto the Mosquito Creek Road. Soon there were wonderful views of the east coast, the bay and beyond the Streslecki Ranges. At the T-junction, we turned left into Overpass Road, where we had walked from the barge landing on our first visit. We were soon on top of the hill and chugging up the track through the scrub to our place. We were greeted by John, a Melbourne dentist who raised cattle on the adjoining paddock below our place in the weekends and stayed in a flat in his hay shed. It was on this trip that we also met a young farmer, Ed Cox, who was one of the large local family, descended from the earliest settlers of the island. He came to deliver the key to the hut and became a warm friend and advisor on many practical matters. I was delighted when he agreed to slash a track around our boundary so we could have access to our back acres. We had purchased 300 acres of dense tea tree scrub, which was on 2 titles. The key enabled us to look inside our hut for the first time. What a mess greeted us. The long, narrow shed, substantially built on concrete blocks with louver windows, had been inhabited by swallows and mice. There was a sitting area with lovely cane chairs, table and cupboard. The sleeping part was furnished with 6 iron bunks and dishevelled bedding. The bathroom consisted of an open-air shower outside on the veranda, and the straight drop toilet was a short distance away up an overgrown track. After a brief picnic on the terrace, our time on the island was up. George had arrived to take us back to the Tankerton Jetty to meet Vin for the return trip across the channel to Stony Point. Hein and my spirits were high, having found how to visit our island retreat. In the early spring of 1976, we brought the 4 children to see the property on a day trip with Vin. Much to our delight, Ed drove us on his newly cut track around the boundary. We rode on a platform on the back of the tractor. The 3 boys, Hank aged 12, Freddie 10 and David 8, were enthusiastic about the adventure. However, I remember that Anna, aged 7, fell asleep as we bounced around the back blocks, up and down the valley of Mosquito Creek headwaters and through the endless acres of tea tree scrub. I held her tightly to be sure she didn't fall off the vehicle. Our land was totally uncleared at this stage and unfenced, although Ed reminded us that it had once been farmed by his father and the cover was regrowth. We had been warned to look out for snakes, tigers and black snakes, as they were quite common, and certainly told the children to watch where they walked. We were particularly careful when going up the narrow path to the long drop toilet a short distance from the hut. It was important not to tread on a snake, as this would invite trouble. The risk of snake bite concerned Hein, and on subsequent visits he took to bringing antivenom with him as a precaution due to the isolation. On this visit, the family set to work clearing and cleaning the inside of the hut. We all heaved the worn and dirty furnishing outside, and with great delight lit a huge bonfire to get rid of the mess. Every inch of the inside was washed and swept clean of bird droppings. Meanwhile, Hine ingeniously hammered together some wooden panels to fit over the windows to stop any more swallows and local creatures from using the hut before our return trip to Stony Point. We felt triumphant in that we had seen our land and cleared up the hut, which was to be our island holiday home. At the time of purchase, we did not know about the prison farm on the island. McLeod Prison Farm had been there since July 1916. It was founded in the hope that rural activity such as forestry, planting of pine trees, Pinus insignis, Pinus pinister, and farming would aid in the rehabilitation of the chosen well-behaved prisoners. A journalist with a visiting cricket team in January 1931 noted, "The visitors were astonished at the progress that had been made, stately pines on either side, then beautiful and well laid out grounds and pretty flowers, well-kept lawns and vegetable gardens." Over the years, prisoners made many attempts to escape. Few succeeded due to the strong currents in the sea surrounding the island and the diligent police on the mainland. At its peak, the prison farm was well appointed with an education block, including a theatrette, chapel, a library and a sports ground and 9-hole golf course. In 1966, the total land under the prison farm was 1,618 hectares. In April 1975, the prison was closed and the prisoners and staff transferred to other prisons. It was difficult to staff and costly. Perhaps it was also due to the culture of illegal drug use amongst the prisoners in the 1970s, and also due to complaints by the long-suffering residents who were frequently threatened by visitors wanting to obtain a boat to escape. Unknown to us, fear of the prisoners was the reason our property had been put on the market. Prisoners often visited residents and demanded a boat for escape across to the mainland. Mike Wood's wife was afraid of such an engagement. We were just fortunate that the prison had been closed for a year by the time we arrived on the scene. I remember taking our family and a group of relatives to visit the prison farm at this time and wandering around the vacant cells, recreation facilities, gardens and management cottages. It was slowly falling into disrepair. The jetty, which was used for supplies from Lang Lang, was still there, and we subsequently used it as a base for several family fishing expeditions. Chapter 3. Travelling by Barge. The only way to get a car or other vehicles onto the island was, and still is, by barge from the beach at Coronella, across the swiftly flowing channel to the barge landing on the east coast of French Island. It is a flat-bottomed, 2-engine boat which can take 2 cars or 1 cattle truck. Our first trip on the barge was on Friday night of Cup Weekend 1976. I remember every detail. After school, we had packed the children into the car, hooked up the trailer, laden with furnishings and equipment for our hut, and driven for over an hour to the beach at Coronella. There, in the falling light, Hine had backed our Kingswood station wagon and trailer up the ramp and onto the barge, with the family on board, a feat he was relieved to accomplish. Then Roy Cox, Ed's younger brother, the 22-year-old driver, had pulled up the ramp, closing the end of the barge, and headed the boat into the sea towards the island. We were the only car on board that evening. It was dark and a fierce wind was blowing. The sea was swirling with peaked waves. The usual trip took about 20 minutes, but it had suddenly become uncertain. The left-hand engine ceased operating mid-channel. The right-hand engine was chugging away and sending us in a circular course across the currents erratically. Forward progress had stopped, and it seemed as though we were doing a strange dance in the one place. I looked at my husband, who was silently standing on the deck, surrounded by our excited children, and wondered at the risk we were taking. My thoughts jumped to the danger we faced. The barge was lopsided. Could it sink? Would we have to swim? Drowning was foremost in my thoughts. Why had I encouraged this trip? With a frozen heart, I considered our options. I heard my voice quietly suggesting that the children take off their gumboots and that the two youngest hold their father, a strong swimmer, and the elder two me. We stood peering over the rail into the wild sea, comforted only slightly by Roy's comment, "She'll be right," to my anxious, "Will we make it?" For what seemed like an eternity, Roy silently struggled with the barge, steering in ways that were still a mystery. He managed to coax forward motion out of the vessel. Some time later, with enormous relief, we docked safely on the barge landing beach at French Island. Despite the risks, we had arrived at our beloved island escape. For the rest of Roy's life, I had complete faith in his barge driving skills. We also took to using the ferry to French Island, which was conditional on stable weather to enable docking at the Tankerton mile-long jetty. Where there was a westerly wind, trips were cancelled. Chapter 4, Family Holidays. Having mastered access to our island property, we spent many happy weekends and Easters there over the next couple of years while the children were in primary school. Sometimes dear friends and family joined us, other times it was just us. When travelling by ferry, we met the local farmers, of whom only the Cox family, Miss Elsie Cox, Roy, the barge driver, and his brother Ed and the Woodruffs were on the west coast with us. It was largely uninhabited, with acres of bush in all directions. We spent most of our time exploring and enjoying the abundant wildlife. Hein was a fund of information, particularly about birds and native orchids, as he had worked as an agricultural scientist in the state government's Fishery and Wildlife Department before studying medicine. He could identify the huge range of birds from minute honey-eaters to large eagles and laughing kookaburras that swooped around us. I was amazed at his sharp eyesight as he pointed out things that I'd not noticed. Koalas sat sleepily in the trees and growled at night like barking dogs. Frogs croaked incessantly, and the occasional echidna would trundle across the clearing. The ground was full of pink and white heath, and at special times a range of wild orchids, bright yellow wattle, and white-flowered tea tree. Rabbits darted about, tempting the boys to chase them, and the black and tiger snakes appeared in the warmer months, alert and to be avoided in spring, but sleepy and ready to hibernate in the autumn. When walking around the beach from the barge landing one day, we were nearly swept aside by a giant sea eagle taking off from a rock in front of us. It seemed like a majestic, small aeroplane as it swooped along the beach, heading out to sea to fish. Hein bought a gun and a licence, and then was able to shoot the odd rabbit, take its coat off, and prepare it for the pot, an event which always attracted a family audience. There were bikes for everyone, which I'd bought second-hand through the trading post. The largest one, with handlebars like stag's horns, was Hein's. Mine was a dilapidated woman's bike, and the boys were certainly okay, but the small one for Anna had stiff wheels that caused her much dismay. We used the bikes to explore the dirt roads around the island. On one such expedition, when we were on the north of the island near Garsides, visiting the ruins of the former salt works, Anna gave up and left her bike on the road in despair. Henk, our eldest, saved the day by dinking her the long trip home. We had few tools to suppress the abundant scrub, and I remember using a hand slasher to cut a track from the hut to the long drop toilet some metres away. There was a small clearing in front of the hut where we built a large open fire and hung a billy and cast iron pot to cook our meals. Mostly grilled chops and sausages, served with salad and followed by pancakes, butter and jam, or marshmallows that the children toasted on sticks in the fire. My cooking was substantially upgraded when Ed, our neighbour, kindly appeared with an iron wood-burning stove on his tractor as a present. He had removed it from an abandoned cottage on his mother's land. He placed it on the veranda, and from then on I was able to cook using both a stovetop and oven while still being outside. At the end of the day, we sat in deck chairs round the fire, trying to remember the names of the stars and marvelling at their brightness. The lights across the bay twinkled in the distance, and we felt remote from civilization in our own private world, at peace. At bedtime, Hein would fill the canvas camp shower bucket with hot water from the fire and hang it from the end of the veranda and invite us one by one to strip off and have a lovely shower. Certainly an exhilarating experience in the night air, after which we would retreat inside the hut, which was lit by a gas lamp, and hop into our sleeping bags in the bunks and sleep soundly until daylight. Chapter 5. A pause in visits to the island. Without my awareness, our children grew older, and as they moved into senior school, sporting commitments and other interests began to dominate their lives. At one stage, we were driving various sons to hockey matches twice on Saturday, and then rushing home to collect another child from a visit to friends or a hike with venturers. Summer holidays were spent on the beach, often Barwon Heads, where the windsurfing craze dominated life. Winter school holidays were spent in the mountains with friends skiing at Mount Hotham. Somehow, homework was squeezed in between. It was a busy time, with Hein delivering babies around the clock, while I spent the time the children were at school running my consultancy in employee welfare, a specialty in occupational health. So it was that we seldom visited French Island for some years. I remember well one evening we were hosting a party for the local scouting group, and a phone call came from a chappie who asked if we were willing to sell our land. Our 300 acres were on 2 titles, and I thought, why not, as we were not using it. There was a pause. He asked which block, the square one or the dogleg one beside it. On the spur of the moment, I chose to keep the dogleg block because it had a great view. The sale was agreed at a substantial profit. We arranged to meet the potential owners at the Tankerton Jetty the next weekend and show them around. Much to my surprise, as we came up the gangway from the ferry, a childhood friend leant down and helped me up the ladder. Mike Sharp and his wife Susie had become our new neighbours. This coincidence was to play a part in encouraging us to make more use of our hideaway in the years to come. Once the sale went through, Mike cleared 3/4 of his block. He engaged Percy Thompson, a local farmer with a huge roller, to push the scrub into high heaps, which they then burnt. This gave us an idea. So we too arranged Percy to push over our tea tree into heaps, and I ran around saying, "Not this tree," to the small messmate saplings in between. We also acquired a dam at this time, which we hoped would be ornamental and encourage frogs and thirsty birds. Some of the family wanted a swimming pool, but it was never deep enough. We were able to keep the 4 acres around the hut clear after this, as we had acquired a second-hand Fordson tractor with a grader blade and a slasher with the help of my brother from Millawa. It looked strange in a trailer on the barge, but proved to be very useful. Hein particularly enjoyed whizzing around with tremendous noise and dust, as I tried to shape planting and garden beds. We planned a drive and a circular car turning spot, and most importantly, a new entrance from the road and gateway on the highest part of the block. I wanted visitors to enjoy a drive through the garden to the house, rather than struggle through boggy swampland from the original lower entrance. The new gate involved building a culvert over the road's table drain. We had to lay pipes in the drain and cover them with soil using the tractor blade. I'm sure we set a record for being the only social worker and doctor who had made such an achievement. This meant we had an all-weather entrance and were no longer dependent on the lower gate, which was often waterlogged. Our interests in French Island blossomed again. Chapter 6. Leaving school years behind and returning to French Island. Lots of plans were made in the early 80s and 90s. New people came to the properties around us, and we were not as isolated as originally. Planning limits on the minimum size of land holdings remained at 80 hectares, so we still had lots of space around us. However, we now had friends to share issues with and help each other. We purchased a kit shed, which was soon installed by Keith Ayres and his son. This provided a shelter for the tractor and a bench and cupboards for storage of tools. The installation of a large water tank was more challenging, and I remember my delight watching it travel up the road from the barge on a truck. It was then put on a tank stand at the top end of the new shed to provide water from the shed roof. Hank used his math skills to calculate the height of the tank and assess it had enough fall to supply the hut with water. With the help of our neighbour Roy, it was soon connected to the hut by laying the underground pipe. The family became expert plumbers, connecting the new water supply to the kitchen and bathroom. Lots of joy with running water in the kitchen sink and shower. We appreciated the experience of living without mod cons. There were no complaints about the lack of city facilities such as electricity, telephones and gas. The challenge of making do was definitely part of the fun. The delight of dinner by candlelight and the chance of playing card games without the interruption of TV was simple fun. By this stage we were keen to extend the hut, and this became a project. With a family of active university students and many friends, developments were achieved. Family and friends laid a concrete slab which doubled the footprint of the hut. Then, with the help of builders, Brian and Melville, walls, windows and roofs were built. Perhaps the greatest joy came from the installation of a pot-bellied stove that also heated water. The boys built a bathroom with indoor shower and toilet. I remember lots of drama in building a septic system. The Seppo tank was transported safely and sat beside the hut for quite a while until the appropriate hole was dug and pipes were laid. Just before it could be completed, a wild wind came through and the tank rolled down the hill and into the dam. Oh dear, the difficulty retrieving it. Somehow, with tow rope and tractor and wet people, it was towed out. Installing in the inappropriate hole was another matter. We thought the job was complete when the tank entered the deep hole in the ground. However, a rainstorm filled the hole with water and the tank popped out. Soon a solution was found by filling the tank with water. Then it was connected and working. How proud we were with our efforts. By the end of the 1980s, we had a largish hut with windows, doors and a tiled floor. There was lots of family activity building a retaining wall with railway sleepers and making a garden bed around the north-facing terrace. Then we turned our attention to social activities and used the grader on the Fordson one weekend with the kind assistance of dear friends Barbie and Bård Solnordal to make a pétanque piece. We spread a load of gravel that had been delivered by barge and surrounded it with pine edging. To this day, it has proved the source of many happy competitions. Throughout this decade, Hein and I planted a 4-acre garden around the hut. This was fenced in with rabbit-proof wire and star posts to keep the plentiful rabbits away from killing our newly planted trees. I remember also that our newly growing garden was threatened by hungry koalas. One day I heard loud cries of abuse from Hein as he looked at a koala eating his pride and joy, an 8-metre-high new blue gum. I rushed to photograph the scene as Hein yelled and waved at the munching enemy as it climbed higher up the sapling. Soon the gum bent over with the koala's weight, and it became close to Hein's head, peeing magnificently with fright. What a photo! Throughout the 80s, we planted a selection of Banksias, flowering gums, Angophora and lemon-scented gums, and lots of other lovely trees. With much thought, we planted a windbreak in the west to shelter the garden. A row of Banksias were also put along the driveway, including serratas, ericofolia and granders. Then in the top paddock we planted rows of Banksias suitable for cut flowers. This included Speciosus, Baxterius and Cochineus. Years later we were honoured with a visit by the famous botanical artist Celia Rossa, who was enamoured with our Banksia collection. I had the joy of providing her with a special flower of Banksia to paint for a customer. Hein and I spent many weekends at the property gardening with great enthusiasm. The family enjoyed us when they could, and Easter was always houseful, and lots of camping as the family became larger with girlfriends and boyfriends. We met many local, mostly farmers, in the southern part of the island and joined two key island groups, the French Island Community Association, FICA, and the French Island Landcare. FICA is an important elected honorary committee responsible for managing the island. This body undertakes the functions normally run by a council, as the island is not covered by a municipal council. FICA membership is open to French island landowners by a small annual subscription. It meets regularly in the community hall at Tankerton. Most islanders are members and follow decisions and actions keenly. These include the management of the island tip, issues of maintenance of the roads, the local fire brigade, the cemetery, reliability of the ferry service to the island, and road safety and tourism. FICA also holds social events such as the Anzac Day service, the Easter Farmers Market, local cricket and football teams and competitions, and Christmas and New Year Eve celebrations. French Island Landcare is another important group on the island. Similarly, it has an honorary committee and membership is by subscription. Their main work is in promoting indigenous vegetation, animals and birds. Local plants are seeded and sold to islanders regularly. Landcare also coordinates programs to control and remove feral animals who damage local wildlife. Projects backed by the Melbourne Zoo to limit the damage of koalas, feral cats, rabbits, deer and pigs are important in ensuring local animals survive. Our family has taken part in many functions of these two bodies and regularly enjoyed the Easter Farmers Market, the general store meeting place, and the advice of the Landcare Group. Our use of Banksia during this time was based on enjoying the hut with a double bedroom and bunks for four and bathroom. We spent many weekends and holidays there, often overcrowding the sitting room. The garden outside was a constant joy. Chapter 7. Visits in the 1990s and 2000s. The 1990 was a time of happy visits for Hein and I and the family to French Island. Easter was always a house-full experience, with Tim and Anna making a bed on the floor of the main room, whilst others enjoyed sleeping outside in their tents. I look back with memories of Easter food in a range of car fridges, as we lacked a fridge. The trips to the general store for more ice was essential. Hein's medical skills proved a resource for distressed islanders on several occasions. A couple of events stand out in my memory. One when Hein and I were alone. I was sitting on the veranda enjoying a moment's rest when a couple of wild-looking fellows arrived by a noisy ute and asked for the dock in great alarm. Hein was on the tractor slashing the back fence line with no way of contact. He was soon found and departed with the men carrying his medical bag. I learned the story some time later when he came home. Our neighbour and barge driver, Roy, had rolled his car on the way home from a party the previous night, and the friends had taken him home. When they called in the next day, they were shocked to see him with neck pain and unconscious. It was obvious to Hein that he had suffered a problem with his upper vertebrae and must be immobilised before being moved. I think Roy's neck was braced and he was carefully moved onto a large door after a shot of painkillers. The plan was to take him by barge to Wonthaggi Hospital on the mainland. Roy was able to explain to his friends how to start the barge, and off they set as Roy lost consciousness. I'm told that stopping on the beach was dramatic. Many years later, Roy's daughter told me that of all the accidents her father had suffered, this particular one was the only one he recovered from without permanent effects. The visitor's book shows that we stayed at Banksia about every second weekend at this time during the 90s, mainly to keep the grass slashed around the house and prune plant growth and look after the garden. I overused the brush cutter one weekend cutting tea tree out of the Banksias lining the drive. It took a whole day's work swinging the cutter back and forward. By the evening, I had a acute tummy ache, and with a special barge trip we got home quickly. Surgery was required to repair my tangled gut and month of sick leave. This led to my retirement from bush cutting work. We enjoyed planting a windbreak on the west side of the garden and to our joy watched lots of tall trees growing. Most of the Banksias were thriving too, and we often had bunches of flowers to take home. Islanders would recognise our friends on the ferry by the flowers they carried. Often locals would ask if they could pick flowers to decorate the hall for functions, which of course I encouraged. Family and friends came for short visits, and we loved showing them around. My sister Janie and Tony and girls brought a student from the US to stay one time, and the koalas proved a great success. Another day, Hein's brother Eric and Elizabeth visited whilst in Victoria from the US. They planned a quick visit for the day while staying with relatives in Flinders. Hein was delighted to have their company. Then, as often happened, the weather turned rough, with a strong west wind, and the ferry was cancelled. To our joy, Eric and Elizabeth had to stay the night, and we made merry enjoying their company. We could only apologise to the relatives in Flinders who had arranged a party in their honour. In the bush we noticed a large number of orchids each spring and learned their names. They preferred to flourish where we had cut back bracken and tea tree or where we had lit a fire. These were plants which rewarded us because the land had not been fertilised for farming purposes. The 90s was a time of the partnerships and weddings. I remember watching with delight as Hank enjoyed Marina's company as he installed the plumbing under the kitchen sink. I later heard that they had each independently planned to propose to each other on this visit to the island. It was also a time of grandchildren appearing. The first was Hank and Marina's Matilde in 1997, and we planted a plantation named after her along the fence of Overpass Road. The next was Anna and Tim's Wishy, who we also planted a plantation, this time of flowering gums and angophora, along the top drive. Wishy first stayed in the hut when small enough to be bathed in the kitchen sink. Barn and Ollie came next in December 1999, then another 7, Naam, Charlotte, Leo, Rudy, Saskia, Zaza and Min, in early mid-2000s. However, I had run out of time to make new plantations for them. In the beginning of 2000, we found out that Hein had a progressive illness, PSP, and it developed. We could not go to French Island. Things we loved in the garden either grew enormous or died under bracken and tea tree. We were too busy to pay attention. The family helped me take Hein to see Banksia for one final trip in 2008. We picked a day when the tides made it possible to arrive and leave by barge on the same day. Hein was pleased to be driven around the garden area and see the plants he loved, which was very worthwhile achievement. It took us about 10 years to arrange a memorial for him in the island cemetery. Chapter 8. My Time Alone. After Hein's death, my time was mine alone, but I only stayed a few times at Banksia without the family. The garden we had planted had become neglected and overgrown, and I was unsure how to rectify it. Tea tree and bracken had taken over, and the taller trees needed pruning and shaping. Much of our Banksia collection had died with the drier weather, whilst others needed attention. No more brush cutting for me owing to previous injuries. The thought of using a mower or the tractor and slasher was beyond me in my 70s. Various family members did their best to help out, but clearly lacked much time with small children and work commitments. Furthermore, the family was now too big to enjoy fitting into the small hut. There was lots of family talk about a possible extension of the hut, which would provide more beds. This seemed a good idea. Eventually I asked some of the locals about available builders and was told that Paul Henwood was the best, but very hard to get. Anna and I thought about this dilemma, and one day we decided to talk to him. We found Paul's address, which was at the end of 10 Chain Road, overlooking Phillip Island. We found our way to his property and enjoyed meeting Paul and his wife, Caroline. They were most hospitable and after a while agreed to consider our request that Paul build us an extension. After several visits and lots of discussion, there was one key moment when he looked at our drawing for a new building with sitting room, double bedroom and bunk room for the grandchildren. He thought for a moment and then said, "Would you mind if I made a pointed roof, not a flat one? A veranda and high windows for ventilation?" With delight we liked these thoughts, but I added a bathroom too, so it was agreed. The building was to commence in November 2013 and be finished by my 75th birthday in July. We made an agreement that Paul would work for $30 per hour for approximately $5,000 and materials a further $5,000. Figures which we progressed and asked for more details. Paul was to use timber from the pine trees at the old prison farm cut by Terry Easy. I was to source second-hand windows and doors from auction houses. Anna and I had fun choosing these and transporting them in my car. It turned out that Doug Churcher kindly agreed to plumb the bathroom to the Seppo. Henk was called on to connect the lighting and plumbing above the floor. Paul was keen to have our young involved, and lots of us were present when the hut was started in November 2013. Our neighbour, Ed, called in and graded a smooth base for the new cottage with the Fordson. Lots of our family were present, including Anna and Tim's family and Henk and Marina's family. All were called on to help dig the holes for the foundation. There was lots of enthusiasm. Well, I do remember getting a pot-bellied stove installed. I collected one day in Dandenong from the shop we had previously bought the stove for the main hut. A slightly larger model was available and was fitted into my boot by a forklift, and off I set to Coronella. The stove was heavy, and I felt as though my wheels were hardly on the road. There was a high wind, and I drove very carefully to the barge landing. A rather scary trip. However, I eventually arrived at the build site, wondering how Paul and his assistant would get it into the new cottage. Much to my amazement, the two men lifted it and placed it on a beautifully crafted slate base in the new building. No worries. Planning the bunk room was fun. With much family discussion, we planned bunks in the tiny room, thinking this would relieve pressure on accommodation. Wishy encouraged Paul to build him a bunk near the ceiling with a sort of ladder for fun, and so we had 5 new beds. I purchased an antique washstand when visiting Penola for a pétanque match. My French friends kindly insisted on bringing the stand home with us. It looked perfect as the bench for the hand basin in the new cottage bathroom. Much to my delight, we were offered lots of useful furniture from the sale of Laurie's farm at Yea. What a sight it was loaded on top of a tractor on a truck on the barge, complete with oil drum barbecue, double bed, leather couches and artworks. By mid-2014, the new building was almost finished. I made many trips to encourage Paul to finalise things. Finally, the day before my birthday in late July, Paul and his daughter finished the deck connecting the new building with the main hut. On the 29th of July, we celebrated my birthday and the opening of the new cottage with a wonderful lunch party. All my children and grandchildren and brother Johnny and Nicky and sister Janie and Tony came for the day. Paul, Caroline and Daisy came too. We had a ceremony when Paul cut a ribbon to open the building, saying of all of the buildings he had built, this was the first time he had cut a ribbon to open it. In all, it was a great development which solved our need for more accommodation and has been much enjoyed. Chapter 10. The Next Decade to 2024. Our little off-the-grid country hideaway had been changed in many ways over the decade. We now have a modern fridge powered by a reliable solar system and lithium battery, lots of accommodation and 2 bathrooms, electric lighting and power for our mobile phones, heating by 2 wood stoves, cooking by gas cylinders supplied by the general store, and hot water for showers after a busy day. However, we have kept the atmosphere of self-sufficiency and independence being totally off the grid. We lack enough power for toasters, hairdryers and other gadgets, including television, but it is still possible to have dinner by a lovely soft candlelight. I am pleased that the grandchildren have enjoyed holidays at Banksia and brought friends to stay too, as they have all got older. They have helped with projects and assisted in many ways. Ollie spent a summer in the cottage while he and 2 friends were employed to build a house for the teacher at the local school. The spa they constructed still stands and continues the practice of spontaneous creative building efforts in many ways. Charlotte has efficiently undertaken the work of being the booking secretary for the past few years, a task she does well in ensuring those staying there know how to work things. She has made an excellent manual to help visitors cope with running the cottage, which is much appreciated. Maintenance of the house and cottage and surrounding garden is still our challenge, although it is possible to employ locals to do essentials like service the tractor, prune the high branches of trees that are in danger of falling, repair the seppo and keep up the supply of firewood for heating. The initiatives over this decade which I enjoy, without giving them priority, can be listed. Firstly, a new garden bed was built by Paul in the summer. He and Doug, using a front-end loader, rebuilt the garden bed by the North Terrace. The original railway sleepers had rotted and needed renewing. I stayed a few days in midsummer with hot weather and to encourage the project. I remember one of the nights I had the door open to let in cooler breezes and was sound asleep to be woken by a crash on the table. Jumping up, I saw a startled Potteroo staring at me, having nibbled an apple on the table. He jumped down and rushed out the door. They are nocturnal animals and often difficult to see. During the winter I planted all sorts of hardy bushes in the new garden bed, hoping they would survive the sandy soil and hot sun. Some time later I arranged for Paul and Doug to clear the front of the house, removing a huge gum tree that was a fire hazard and the old tin entrance we had used for years to shelter us as we entered the hut. This was to make it possible for Paul to build a new porch over the entrance and a large deck around to the south side where there was a view of the bay. After 9 years after the loss of Hein, I caught up with an old friend from school days. We enjoyed each other's company, and he had just lost his wife Susie after a long illness. We had much in common. I invited him to French Island, wondering what he would think of it, as he had run his own country property near Mansfield for many years with his brother. Much to my surprise, he understood the joy we have at Banksia and my wish to recover the lost garden. The first thing he helped me with was the upgrading of the electrical system. A local electrician, Trevor, had quoted on increasing our power system and adding many new solar panels. We spent several days in the house helping Trevor change the system and install a new one with a lithium battery, replacing the many old ones. The upgraded electricity system made it possible to consider buying a fridge. No more dashes to the general store for ice to keep Esky going. Hank sourced one, and then the fun began. As we were unable to get it delivered to French Island, other arrangements had to be made. I sought the advice of Terry, the barge driver owner, and a plan was worked out. The fridge was delivered to a Van Stensel's hardware shop near Grantville on the mainland. Terry loaned us his trailer, which Mick and I connected at the barge landing in Coronella and drove to Van Stensel's. The fridge was then lifted by forklift onto the trailer, and we drove to the barge. After the sea voyage, we soon had it at the side door of Banksia House. Many thanks to Glynis and her husband, who welcomed us and helped lifting the fridge into the house. Problem solved with payment of several slabs of beer. The new entrance from the east became a smart front door when we gained 2 glass doors from David and Anoni's renovations in Richmond. Mick was a great help in collecting the doors from David's house, and with his son Charlie fixed them to the roof of my car for the trip to the barge. We made several trips to the tip to dispose of the bits and pieces that had accumulated in the old entrance. We called on Hank Skills to help Paul on this occasion, as the wall of the hut had to be rebuilt and wiring was a concern. At about this time, Anna and I visited the quarry where Doug sourced road metal. Doug had told us that he had some large granite stones, too big to break up for roadworks. He offered them to us as garden features. We looked at lots of stones and chose some. Much to my delight, a little later 6 large granite blocks arrived at Banksia. Mick and I had such fun deciding where they were placed and which way up they should stand. In all, there are 1 each side of the front porch, 1 by the steps to the north terrace, and a couple at the entrance of the drain to the dam. This was when we thought of arranging a large granite stone to be used as a memorial to Hine in the local cemetery was first mentioned. Mick and I met with Lewis and Keith Ayres, the caretakers of the cemetery, and arranged to choose and purchase a plot. However, it wasn't until after Mick and my wedding in 2019 and at the end of the COVID lockdowns that we finally achieved this memorial. Mick and I watched Doug and his 2 staff deliver the 2-ton stone to its place in the cemetery. There was one more new development recently. David decided that new kitchen benches and sink would be a benefit. He managed to find a superb kit where cupboards were topped with fine wood, and he planned to put it together and install it. Mick and I were at Banksia the weekend David, Inoni and Ollie finished putting it all together. We now have a fine-looking set of cupboards and bench tops, and most importantly, double sinks for dishwashing, which is a much improved resource. Appreciation and many thanks. In closing my story at Banksia at French Island, I must thank many of my dear family who kindly encouraged me and helped me with this small endeavour. My story of Banksia would not have been completed without the assistance of my daughter Anna, her daughter Zaza, and my grandson Barn. I particularly appreciate their modern computer skills.